Everybody. Much for joining us for this webinar. Hopefully everybody can see and hear us okay. My name is Jack Chelman. I'm Chief Project Officer at the Global Returns Project, which is our host for this evening. Thank you to everyone who's joining, everybody who's watching this recording afterwards, if you're watching post-event and catching up. Thank you, of course, to our wonderful panelists and our keynote speaker, who we will be introducing in just a moment. And finally, as always, thank you to the excellent Global Returns Project team, Georgie, Jemima, and Rachel, for helping coordinate all this. Now, I think everybody knows this evening that we're here to talk about carbon offsets and some alternatives and complements to those. Just a quick introduction, and then we'll get things started. As the effects of the climate crisis become more obvious, more destructive, and more complex, all of us as individuals or representing businesses or institutions may well feel increasing pressure to trust in solutions that feel simple, solutions that seem easy to understand. Tonight, as I said, we're going to talk about carbon offsets, and that's because offsetting is one such solution that can feel simple. What do we do about rising greenhouse gas emissions? Well, it might feel simple to purchase a credit to mitigate the emissions we're responsible for. The challenge is that offsetting isn't that simple. There are real variations in the quality of carbon offsets, and there are some very important solutions that just can't be packaged into an offset at all. So tonight, we'll talk about the role in particular of philanthropic giving, what we'll call climate contributions, as a complement or alternative to an individual or corporate purchase of offsets. Before we get into our keynote, I will turn things over to my colleague Georgie to give a quick introduction. Thanks very much. Over to you, Georgie.
Thanks, Jack. So I'm going to introduce our lovely keynote speaker. Kresse Wesling is an award-winning global environmental entrepreneur. She has a background in venture capital and startups, and in 2005, after learning that London's fire hoses were being sent to landfill, Kresse co-founded Elvis and Kresse to rescue discarded materials to transform sustainable handcraft luxury accessories. What began with fire hoses has now expanded to 12 different waste streams with charitable partnerships across the industry. Elvis and Kresse, my mistake, is a founding B Corp, donating 50% of all profits to good causes, including the London Fire Brigade, and in 2017 partnered with Burberry Foundation to repurpose leather offcuts into luxury goods. For her contributions, she received a CBE in 2021, and today she joins us to share more about her journey.
Thanks, Georgie. So that's a fantastic introduction. It leaves me with very little to say, actually. I'm sorry I'm somewhat in the dark here. I don't have very great lighting in my workshop. We're based in Kent on a farm. A little bit of maybe deeper background. I moved to the UK in 2004, and I'm a different kind of tourist. I'm a overwhelmingly curious person. I've always been obsessed with waste. I've always been obsessed with the things that we reject, also the things that we eat. So when I first came to the UK, I wanted to know what we ate here and what we threw away. My first day, I was in the sewers, which I suppose combines both things. And after seeing this sort of beautiful underground monument to moving things around, I realized that although the sewage system that the Victorians built was beautiful, all it did was take something from A to B. And then I wanted to see, what does a waste transfer station look like here? What does a recycling facility look like here? And these were the things that I did in my first week in the UK, because it was the first time in my life that I just, I guess, let rip and really explored everything that I was curious about. And what I discovered was pretty brutal. The UK at the time had the worst recycling rates in Europe. We sent 100 million tons to landfill in that year. And I couldn't really understand that quantity. It didn't matter if I put it in terms of blue whales or big red buses. It was an inconceivable amount, particularly on a small island where there is no way. And I wanted to solve that big problem. But how do you solve that big problem? And actually, the best way I could think of doing that in my mid-20s with no money was to solve one problem and then use that as a platform for solving more problems. So then the hunt really began, and that is when I fell in love with a decommissioned fire hose and really fell in love with it. It's life-saving, heroic material, and after 25 years of service, it just gets landfilled. Or if it gets too damaged to repair, it just gets landfilled. So I started bringing it home, which was unsustainable. And then after months of research, realized that maybe the best way to save it would be to deploy it in the way the luxury companies were deploying leather. Now, I discovered there was a few of the big luxury brands that were using a very similar material to the nitrile rubber that makes up hoses. And then I looked into the luxury industry and I realized that that was a structural failure along the lines of what we're talking about tonight. So although the luxury industry makes beautiful things and expensive things and things that people certainly want to buy and aspire to own, at the time, the World Wildlife Fund commissioned a study into the luxury industry and discovered that it was scoring, I think L'Oreal scored a C somewhere, but overall, in terms of people and planet, the industry was a structural failure. And to me, if you're failing people and planet, you fail. I don't care if you're making money. If you're failing people and planet, you should not have a right to exist as a corporate entity. Now, is that radical or is that sensible? We set up Elvis and Kresse to save the fire hose, but then with this in mind, we set it up to challenge everything about the luxury industry. Everything about packaging, everything about trend, everything about fashion week, everything about overconsumption, everything about, change and the ephemeral and the need to have 25 different belts. If you buy one of my belts, it's going to last you your lifetime. And if something happens to it, I'll fix it for you. This is the philosophy that flows through the business. So this is now a 20-year journey that started in 2005. And how do we get to where we are 15 materials later? And I think largely it's because we had three pillars. We rescue materials, we transform them into beautiful things, and we give 50% of the profits away. The giving element, which to me just made sense from day one. We're in kindergarten, and the first thing that we're taught when we're sent off to school as tiny little teeter-tottering kids is that we should share. It's a fundamental value. And yet the rest of our education, we learn how to be selfish. And actually, when you give, you have no idea what that unlocks. We were a tiny little business with very little chance of success. The rates of businesses, what is it? 1 in 5 businesses makes it to 5 years. In the fashion industry, it's probably 1 in 20. And the reason we succeeded, I believe 100%, was that we decided we were rescuing fire hose and we were going to give 50% of the profits to the firefighters charity. It was this circle of rescue, transform, donate, change the linear system. And not just in terms of materials, but in terms of the flow of capital. So suddenly we weren't just a tiny little business anymore. We were this wonderful business that had 66,000 firefighters as brand ambassadors, and their friends and their families, and websites like uniformdating.com that seem to exist to help people find a firefighter that they can partner up with. Right? So charitable giving isn't just good, doesn't just do good. It creates a whole set of stakeholder relationships that make you resilient, that make your business fit for the future, and that frankly just make everyone feel good. There's these bus advertisements about, not bus advertisements, there's these advertisements for Horlicks. It's this thing that you put in milk and it helps you sleep at night. We don't need that. We don't need Horlicks. We don't need hot baths. We just feel good. And I think it's because the business is structured fundamentally to do good. And then we get to a phase with our business in particular about 6 or 7 years ago when we realized that, yes, we're tackling this material issue and the circular flow of capital and inequality, and we do apprenticeships and all these wonderful things, but we weren't tackling climate change directly, and we weren't tackling biodiversity loss directly. And we thought, how do we actually redesign the business so that the business itself is regenerative, so that the business itself does vastly more good than bad, so that we can sequester more carbon than we emit, so that we can treat more water than we consume, so that we can generate more renewable energy than we use. And we couldn't work out how to do that unless we bought a farm. So we bought a farm, and we are not farmers, and it was COVID, and maybe that was crazy, but actually it's also like the 50% donation turned out to be the best thing that we possibly could have done. So instead of, I suppose, offsetting, which I've always been incredibly skeptical about, we decided to build carbon sequestration into our business so that the very act of our being sucks carbon out of the sky. And we do that because the farm is practicing regenerative agriculture. And when you have healthy soil, it can grow and grow and grow. It can hold more microorganisms, and microorganisms are carbon. And when they die in the soil, they don't just rot and release methane, they can lock that carbon in for good. So it's a phenomenal way of basically redesigning the business to be better, to do more. So that's my t-shirt, that's my personal motto. And it's a way of explaining that maybe an offset is good in the short term. So not every business has the freedom that we do. Not every business leader is as radical as I am, but you can do these things if you just make the appropriate decisions. And while you're making those decisions, if you want to offset in the short term, fine. But the best solution is always going to be to find a way to fold that into your business. We've always folded it in through charitable giving. So when we donate to Barefoot College, we create scholarships for women to train as solar engineers. That's wonderful because they are then deploying and maintaining solar infrastructure, which obviously helps with climate change. And we can do it directly with the farm. So I guess it's a business should not just be considered what its output is, but how it operates. And I think the more you can embed charitable giving specifically to achieve climate and biodiversity goals, the happier your business is going to be, the more resilient it's going to be, the more stakeholders you're going to have, the more business you're going to get. And I suppose karma really, really does work in that respect. The Global Returns Project, and why I think it's quite interesting, is that finding charitable partners isn't always easy. Now, when we collected the fire hose and we knew we wanted to give half of the profits away, the firefighters' charity was quite obvious. But when we started collecting leather waste, finding a charitable partner was not easy at all, because we had this idea that cows were linked to climate change, but finding a charity that could address that was actually quite complicated, and it took us ages to do that. So I do think that when you have specific goals and specific climate targets that you want to meet, a project like this is brilliant because you can find an organization that can help you find the appropriate charity partners that's going to achieve the targets that you want to achieve, and do it in a way that's benchmarked, that's rigorous, and that gives you the kind of reporting that's going to make your life easy, particularly if you're B Corp certified like we are. And when you recertify, all they want to have is all of these wonderful and magical reports that when you give ad hoc to charities like we did is actually quite complicated. So having an intermediary to do the rigorous assessment and provide you with the reports is invaluable and will save you a lot of late nights. I think also that it's important to note that the GRP portfolio of charities are being matched through the 31st of March. So there's still 100K of match funding available, which is really, really spectacular. I think the final note that I really want to leave you with is that if our 20-year journey proves only one thing, it's that all of these things are possible. Is that you can create a regenerative business, you can do wonderful things for the environment, you can do it in a circular way, you can redistribute funds, and you can still exist. And it doesn't make you weaker, it makes you stronger. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Kresse. Thanks for your inspiring words, and it's really amazing to think about what a business can be, not just sort of thinking about what it needs to be confined by based on all our preconceptions. So it's really exciting what you all are doing. We're now going to move into our panel discussion, and let me start by introducing our panelists, and then we'll get into things. So with us this evening, first, Amarachi Seery is Sustainability Manager, Real Estate Impact and Regulations Lead at Schroders Capital. Callum Hunt is Carbon Markets Manager at Cloverly. And last but not least, Emma O'Brien is a lawyer at the incredible charity Client Earth, which is one of the charities that the Global Returns Project has in our portfolio. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Before we do, let's dive into some questions for our panelists. And Callum, I'd like to start with you if we can. We've heard about some challenges, perhaps some limitations associated with carbon offsetting, or at least a bit of skepticism. And I'm wondering if you can just elaborate on that from a technical perspective. People might have heard about the terms permanence or additionality when thinking about offsetting, and I'm wondering what the research tells us about why these might be a challenge for certain offsets.
Awesome, great question. So I think there are a lot of different ways to view offsets that are important when we think about the limitations. So one of the first things to consider is how a company is incorporating offsetting into their strategy. If you're looking at maybe a ton for ton approach, then if you're a business that has a low OPEX to emissions ratio, it's going to be really difficult to access projects that will have more impactful solutions or community engagement, because you're really restricting the pool of credits you can select from, because your dollar per ton budget is lower. Talking about offsets themselves, there are some fantastic projects out there, but it is really important to consider the factors that you'd mentioned. So permanence, first of all, it's key to consider that these projects are very, very different. Some of them, they're removing carbon through nature-based mechanisms. Some are focusing on engineered carbon removals, and other projects are focusing on protecting the existing carbon stocks that we've got. So permanence is all about, basically, if it's a removal solution, how long is that carbon being removed for? And what sort of durability are we looking at? Whereas it's nice to then think of a sort of maybe a REDD+ project where you're protecting forest from being converted to either agricultural practices for monoculture plantations or to be basically for timber harvesting. It's nice to then think about that, of the longevity of that project, how easy it is to engage the project and protect that sink. So permanence is an important one to consider, and the challenges we've seen is that there's variability between the projects. Nature-based removal solutions are at a higher risk of reversal from natural disasters, and they try and mitigate those risks through buffers or through preventative measures, and you need to identify projects that are doing that effectively. Whereas with some of the other solutions, they may do a really good job of locking the carbon away, but they may be really high up the cost curve, and that might be prohibitive for some buyers to consider. Additionality was the other sort of quality pillar touched on, and additionality is all about the role of carbon finance. So ultimately, what sort of revenue from the carbon credits is going to local communities, and is it essential for that project to actually happen? One of the challenges in the market historically is some projects would be operating and they'd make perfect economical sense to operate without the need for the carbon markets. So there's been a lot of sort of transformation within the space recently, especially when it comes to quality factors, to really screen them and make sure that A, there's a clear role for carbon finance, and B, as well as sort of permanence, carbon accounting, leakage, and other factors that need to be considered, they're being appropriately mitigated and accounted for when we're actually looking at these projects. So we have historically seen challenges with offset projects, although the market has always had some projects that have been really high quality, and identifying those high quality projects is the challenge that we need to do. We need to find the projects that engage communities, they drive environmental and social impacts, and they do a good job of either removing or protecting the carbon stocks.
Well, thanks, Callum. That's a great place for us to start. Amarachi, I want to turn to you now, and we've just heard some technical insights into offsetting. I'm wondering how those translate into realities for corporates. From your perspective, what are some of the risks that might come up around offsetting for a corporate donor?
I would say that just speaking specifically from a real estate perspective, it doesn't actually deal with the fundamental issues associated with the buildings itself, which is that you're going to be paying more, using more carbon, and you're also going to be in a building that eventually will be stranded because of regulations. So offsetting can be a good stopgap. I should declare from the outset that Schroders does use offsetting as part of its own sustainability strategy, but certainly within real estate, we would advocate for carbon reduction first for a lot of the reasons that I've mentioned. The other side of this, which is often not talked about, is the human side. Every last one of us right now is inside a building. And all of us have to experience that building in terms of the consequences of having to heat and cool it and the carbon associated with that. And in some cases, especially for people who are inside their own homes, we've got a situation in this country where people are having to choose between heating and eating. So we have an opportunity here to actually focus people on the right path, which is to decarbonize as much as possible, and then to look at look at this more from a social perspective in terms of contributing to the solutions rather than just getting a tick box.
Thanks, Amarachi. Emma, I want to get your perspective on this, and I know Client Earth has some strong views on carbon offsets. Can you just share a little bit of that for us?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Jack. So I suppose the Client Earth perspective on carbon offsets is very aligned or informed by what Callum was talking about and the issues that are associated with offsets like additionality and like permanence. So our starting point, again, like Callum touched on, is that it's scientifically impossible to offset carbon emissions on a ton for ton basis. And the whole concept is fraught with issues because of the problems that Callum mentioned. And there's also a real risk when companies talk about offsets that that narrative can inhibit climate action, but because it diverts resources, or it can divert resources from other worthwhile action when it's spoken about in that way of ton for ton offsetting. So at Client Earth, our position is really aligned actually with what Jackie said earlier. So we support the replacing of a compensation narrative with a contribution narrative. So it's widely accepted that a lot of the money spent on offsets can contribute to really worthwhile projects. But instead of a company paying X amount of money to offset X amount of carbon emissions, they are making a contribution towards projects that can have a positive impact on the environment and on communities. So that's kind of where Client Earth stands.
Thanks, Emma. That's super interesting. Amarachi, back to you for a second. When it comes to sustainability, obviously, and you were alluding to this before, the most important thing for a corporate to do is reduce emissions, right? That needs to be step one. I wonder if you could just speak to the importance of that work. And obviously, this is going to be something that you all think about a lot in terms of real estate.
Absolutely. So I should say that I am biased because I work in real estate, and real estate is 40% roughly of all carbon emissions on the planet. So I would absolutely say that if a corporate was to look at this, they should first look at their buildings and to look at whether they've actually got the most efficient buildings, whether they've got buildings that are going to stand the test of time in terms of not becoming stranded assets. And I would also say that they should look at buildings in terms of whether they could actually be part of the solution. So are there renewables? Is there nature planting on the building itself? All of these things contribute. I think the other thing that is often missed and something that we're now looking at as investors is the human side of this. Some of these projects don't have the social efficacy that frankly they should. And often a lot of these offset projects are done in locations where there is a high level of vulnerability for things like child labour and other labour abuses and human rights abuses. So one of the things that we also do as investors is that we've been engaging with other companies on how do they address these issues, because actually we've got a client base. We're very fortunate to have a client base that is interested in this and does not want their money associated with some of the worst kinds of evils that a person can do to another person.
Thanks, Amarachi. And Callum, I think just to come back to you for a second, the challenge of emissions reductions is, of course, that at the present moment, most companies will only be able to reduce their emissions to a certain extent. And I think that's probably where some of these conversations that we've been having come in for companies that are trying to do something about emissions they can't reduce further. Emma mentioned this concept of a climate contribution. Can you expand on that a little bit and how a contribution approach could play a meaningful role in a company's net zero pathway?
Definitely, and it's something that's gaining a lot of traction within the corporate procurement side of carbon credits. You know, a lot of corporates are looking for either an activity that is delivering positive environmental or social impacts, and they're either doing that through the voluntary carbon market or through engaging directly with initiatives which are implementing these practices, and they're setting out quantifiable metrics that allow you to track progress. Whether it's like if you're looking at a cook stove project, it's X amount of stoves that are being distributed, or if you're looking at a regenerative agricultural project, it's looking at changes in yield as you're reducing nitrogen-based fertilizers and focusing on more natural inputs. It's something that's similar to a dollar per ton approach, where instead of being incentivized to maximize for volume, you're trying to take that budget and maximize for impact. So similar to identifying good quality carbon credits, corporates are not seeing it as a replacement for reducing their own emissions, but something that helps them bridge the gap and take accountability for unabated emissions as they progress towards their net zero targets. When they reach that point, obviously there is a role for the durable removal offsets to target, especially in hard to abate sectors, those residual emissions. But it's something that as they're trying to reach that point, it lets them be transparent about their impact and focus on supporting solutions that resonate with them. So they're finding a way to identify projects that are delivering both a carbon benefit, but also, and more importantly, an environmental and social benefit in regions that may be perversely and sort of negatively affected by the impacts of climate change more so than other areas within the globe. So that equitable distribution of revenue from carbon credits or from these incentives is really important for those purposes. And the potential impact of the climate contribution model is huge. You know, it's something that in the carbon markets, trying to support an ex-ante project, something that's at the start of a reforestation effort, can be really challenging because some registries will only certify credits once the removal has taken place, which could be 10 or 20 years after the planting activity. But when you need that carbon finance and you need the benefit is when you're starting the activity sometimes, because debt financing doesn't always work. So you have to look at what economically makes the most sense and where the capital is needed, and not just sort of trying to support solutions that fit that ton for ton unit budget narrative. So there is a clear role for climate contributions to drive impact on that transition period. It is important that we remember the mitigation hierarchy, so that companies do prioritize those reductions and the changes that they can do in-house, or any sort of efficiency improvements in terms of energy consumption, or just changing their supply chain. And the carbon markets are starting to look to insets, which is where you would then link these initiatives to your supply chain as a way to build resilience to climate change, but also strengthen your supply chain. And economically, you don't want to lose your raw materials if there's negative impacts. You want to build resilience within your own business. So there's a lot of places where we have to think, how does this all sort of fit together? And that's always the challenge of these pieces. But I think a company, especially that wants to take a climate leadership perspective, will see this as a complementary way for them to make a meaningful contribution to planet and people, while they prioritize the other aspects of their sustainability strategy and do it transparently, but build trust with their stakeholders that this is a systemic change. It's not just a fad or something popular. You know, this is important stuff that we're discussing, and it needs to be taken seriously at all levels of the hierarchy.
I think it's that point about systemic change for me that's so important about the contribution model as well, Callum, because this is a way for companies to support projects that are a little more qualitative, as you were suggesting, and not be confined only by what can be counted up, but think a little more broadly, because there are so many things we need to be doing for our planet that just can't be packaged up into a single number. Emma, you work for the kind of charity that could receive a climate contribution, and indeed, as Kresse suggested, that viewers could give to via the Global Returns Project. Tell us a little more about Client Earth, your work, why it's important, and I think maybe very interestingly, why Client Earth's work couldn't fit into a standard offset.
Yeah, sure. So as we heard in the introduction, Client Earth is a legal environmental NGO, and we work to ensure existing laws are respected, existing environmental and climate laws are respected, and also to help governments develop effective environmental policies. So what that means is that, well, we say that we work across the full life cycle of the law, from advice and advocacy and support at the stage that laws are being drawn up and implemented, and then taking legal action, strategic legal action when necessary, to ensure that laws are enforced. And that kind of fits with what you're saying, Jack, about a systemic approach, because that's kind of always forefront of our mind, that, you know, we're trying to have a systemic impact with our strategic litigation and legal actions. So I guess some examples of our work on the advocacy side, on the topic of offsets, an example would be our current work on the EU Green Claims Directive, which is a proposed EU law which would introduce minimum requirements on the substantiation, verification and communication of voluntary environmental claims and environmental labelling beyond what's already provided for in EU law, because EU law already provides that companies need to substantiate and verify and communicate accurately what they're saying about carbon offsets. And then at the other end of the spectrum, an example of a legal enforcement action would be the greenwashing case against KLM that Client Earth supported. So Client Earth supported the Dutch NGO Fossilvrij in a case against the airline KLM, which I'm sure everyone's heard of, which they actually won last year when the Amsterdam District Court found that KLM was liable for a breach of the EU Unfair Commercial Practice Directive because of their greenwashing messaging. So their kind of marketing included messaging around, promotions around how customers could offset the carbon emissions of their flights by paying an extra amount. So it was a classic offset. And the court found that offsetting could be messaged as a contribution to projects, to combating deforestation, to the sort of projects that offsetting tends to go to. But it couldn't be messaged as literal offsetting of carbon emissions of a specific customer's specific flight on a kind of carbon ton for carbon ton basis. So I guess we think this work is broadly important because it is all focused on impact. And that's not just through a win in court. Like I was saying, it's across the full life cycle of the law. And our focus through all of the work we do is on tangible systemic change. So, for example, the KLM litigation I just mentioned, highlighted broader greenwashing across the aviation industry. And this has already been seen in the fact that issues in the case have been taken up by a European consumer organisation called BEOC, who have launched an EU-wide regulatory complaint against 17 airlines. So yeah, and also on what you mentioned about the funding the client Earth gets not being connected to offsets. So our work is supported by funders, by very generous funders like Global Returns Project and other individuals and organizations. But we make no claims about our work compensating for carbon emissions. So any funders who donate to us can't claim on their part that they are using those contributions or donations to compensate for their own emissions. So our funders know that their work is being used for strategic legal actions against governments and corporations to hold them accountable for their impact on the climate. And this kind of climate contribution narrative, like Global Return Project portfolio organizations use, gives companies an opportunity to address climate change through tangible solutions.
Thanks, Emma. And Amarachi, I want to close out because I know you've talked in other settings about a concept I love, a phrase I love called sustainability beyond compliance. And I just wonder if you could, I think that ties so well into this whole discussion around what corporates and any individual can do, thinking beyond just offsetting. I wonder if you could tell us what you mean by that phrase.
So when I talk about sustainability beyond compliance, it means a business or an organization proactively looking to address sustainability issues and not just looking at the risks, but also looking at the opportunity set. So from our side, we look at the opportunities in sustainability in terms of what kind of products can we create that will then address environmental and social issues and also cover the financial side, because we believe really that there shouldn't be a conflict between the two. You should be able to make money and also be a good environmental and corporate citizen. So a brilliant example of this within Schroders has been the impact business. Schroders has been doing impact investing now for over 2 decades. And we're very unique in the space because of that. There's not many asset managers that have an impact business the way that Schroders does. And as a result, it's allowed us to create some impressive products related to strengthening the green infrastructure that already exists, but it's also allowed us to tackle social issues as well. And one of the things that I focus on in particular is the social and affordable housing issue in the UK. Even though we're a social fund, at the heart of that fund, we're also looking at environmental performance, and we're not looking to invest in any building that has a low EPC rating or will become a stranded asset, because we don't see that as actually being in line with the social values of the fund. If a home costs too much to heat in the winter and to cool in the summer, then we haven't done our job either. So those are some of the examples that I would point to of going beyond compliance. The final thing I would say about going beyond compliance is that it's good business sense. We know that some of this stuff is coming. So Callum and Emma have talked about regulatory pressures that are coming. So if we can see those things and work towards adjusting our business practices for a soft landing in relation to those in relation to the regulatory pressures, then we have not only delivered good fiduciary duty to all of our shareholders and all of our clients, but we've also made a big difference by showing that this can be done early. And I think that's also really important. It's worth noting, and some of this came up when Kresse spoke as well. A lot of people, it's very easy to do sustainability and to talk about sustainability when you're in an environment where other people are also talking about sustainability. But we've got to remember that many sustainability professionals are the lone voice of sustainability within their organizations. And having examples of corporates doing the right thing gives them more agency and more evidence to take to their senior leadership to also persuade them that, yes, this is the right thing to do.
Sustainability beyond compliance. I love that phrase. Thank you, Amarachi. Thanks, Callum, Emma, and thanks as well to Kresse, who wasn't able to stay the whole time due to some other obligations, but so grateful to have had her insights for our keynote. In just a second, we're going to see if we have any questions and then let people get back to their evenings. Before we do, let me just conclude by saying a couple words about the Global Returns Project, which has come up here and there during our discussion. As many who are watching this live or recorded will know, the Global Returns Project is a UK charity, and essentially we make it as easy as possible for any individual and any corporate donor to support high-impact climate and nature charities. We're advised by leading environmental scientists who have helped us produce a proprietary methodology for selecting and assessing charities. We use that methodology to put together a diverse portfolio of some of the best charities in this space. We report on them, monitor them, donations come to us as a charity, and we distribute 100% to the organizations that a donor wants to support without any deductions at all. Our core costs are all entirely separately funded. A question we often get asked is why give through the Global Returns Project instead of giving directly to the underlying charities? And of course, our first answer is any donation is hugely impactful and really, really important. But we tend to talk about our model having three main benefits. First, our donors don't lose anything because we don't take any deductions. A standard donation gets split equally among the charities, but if a donor wants to give to just one or a few of them, they can let us know, and that's absolutely fine. Two, our donors get quite a bit of extra stuff. They get our impact reports, our events, our community of like-minded people. And the third thing I think is really important, which is that giving through the Global Returns Project, even though people don't lose anything, they get a little bit of extra impact. And that's because every pound that comes through our model helps us make a stronger and stronger case to other individuals and other institutions to do the same. So it's a bit of collective leverage, essentially. Kresse mentioned that this is a really good time to get involved with the Global Returns Project. We happen to have a generous supporter who is providing up to £150,000 in match funding for donations made to all 6 of our charities via GRP. That match funding is available until the end of this month. So there's still a bit of time if you want to double your impact for the planet by working through GRP. We still have, as Kresse said, about 100 or 90,000 pounds left. So get in touch if you'd like an updated figure on what's left, but there should still be time to get the donation matched. Thank you again to everyone. If we were live, I would say let's give a round of applause for everyone, but I hope our panelists know how much we appreciate their time. And let's see if we have any questions. And if not, we will, as I said, let people get back to their evenings. I don't see any questions right now. Georgie or Jemima, do you see any questions? No, I don't think so. Oh, we have one from Natasha. Amarachi, you mentioned stranded assets. Can you just explain what this means in relation to carbon and the climate? I think that's a good call out, actually.
So stranded assets are assets that we know will not reach net zero by 2050, and there's no way of actually improving them, or there wouldn't be a way of improving them without significant capex, without significant expenditure. So when we talk about stranded assets from a real estate perspective, there are a lot of buildings that, well, I would say 80% of all buildings, certainly within the UK, will be here by 2050. So we then need to look at the existing buildings that we have and go, okay, how do we make sure that these ones are net zero? It's not just about building new, but it's also about converting what we have to be low and zero carbon.
I don't see any other questions, so I think we're going to assume that that's the end of them. Thank you again, Amarachi, Callum, and Emma. Thanks to everybody who's tuned in. This recording will be available on our YouTube channel after.